Hey church, Pastor Shane here with another community group discussion starter video. This week we were back in the book of Acts, continuing on in chapters 12 and into chapter 13, where we read three accounts of God's unstoppable power, of his sovereign power at work to move forward the plan of the church. And through those, we got an idea of God's power and majesty and then kind of how we should respond to it as well. You remember the three accounts that we read over. The first was that persecution had come to the church again, this time through Herod, who killed James. And Peter was at threat of doing the same, and Peter was kind of awaiting execution in jail. And as he was waiting there, an angel freed him through this kind of a miraculous set of events. And we saw God save Peter so he could continue doing the work of the church just as Jesus Christ had said that Peter would. In the second count, Herod is giving this big speech and people kind of call him a god, and rather than correcting them, Herod takes the credit for himself and God actually strikes him dead. Kind of a terrifying story of God's power, but that he defends his holiness and who he is. And the result of that is that the church is spared some persecution by Herod in the future. And so we see God's sovereign hand once again protecting the church, this time through kind of a frightening set of events. And then the third story is that of Paul and Barnabas going across on another missionary journey. And this time they were going to share the gospel not only with the people, but a proconsul who was interested in hearing more about this gospel thing they've been hearing about through the people, more about this Jesus movement. And but there was if you've seen Lord of the Rings, like a worm tongue, someone whispering into the ear of the leader evil things about the church. And Paul says, listen, God's going to blind you because of this thing you are doing, you evil servant. And that's exactly what happens. He's blinded, and the proconsul ends up believing in Jesus Christ. And so once again, we see God's sovereign hand, his power at work to move forward the plan of the church. And it's just a reminder of us to rely on God for his power, because there's all these things that are tempting us to trust in something other than God's power, right? To trust in human institutions, to trust in human traditions, to trust in human effort and strength, whether that's politics, whether that's institutions, even like the church, like not to forget the churches and what we're following. We're following Jesus Christ. Things like wealth and financial security, any of those things we kind of put our hopes in that is not God, that we rely on for our security, for the world being the way we want it is. Those things all fall short. The only thing we can really rely on is God. And we talked a couple ways that we need to keep in mind as we learn to rely on him. Because it's easy to say it, it's a whole other thing to actually do it. And so I mentioned two things at the very end. One, that sometimes it's going to be a little bit messy from our perspective. Sometimes God is not going to always work the way we want to. Sometimes it's still going to be hard. We saw the church was being persecuted. Even as God was acting in miraculous ways, the church still had to go through suffering and difficulty. We need to be reminded that God's ultimate plan is not to raise up some human institution or to solve the surface level human problems, but he is building his kingdom. And that is where God's focus is. And so that's where our focus should be as well. And so if we see God not acting in a way we hoped he would, we have to remember, oh yeah, God's plan is much bigger than that. He's working on the scale of building a kingdom for himself. His priorities are going to be aligned with building that kingdom, not necessarily with our own comfort. So that was kind of the first one. That kind of reorients us to the way God sees the world. And the second one was to do what the early church did, to pray. And that may seem like an obvious thing to suggest in a sermon, but it is important for us to pray specifically for God's help, to actually say those things to God. God, I am weak. God, I cannot do this on my own. And to pray that and then to ask for his help, because that not only asks the person who could actually do something for us, the triune God, master of heaven and earth, but it also reorients our own mind when we ask for help to be able to rely on him. You're going to be talking about God's power today. You're going to be talking about learning to lean on God's power and how to turn away from the temptation of leaning on human institutions, human logic, human power that we are all tempted with from time to time. And I hope by the end of your conversation, you'll kind of come to that same place like, yeah, the Lord is faithful. I need to rely on him. And we're on this trajectory of maturing in our growth and our reliance on the God who really can do anything. We'll talk to you soon.